Thank you, everybody. It's my first South by Southwest, so thank you, Morgan. Thank you, everybody who organized this great event. This is the placard that I put up when I give speeches on the Senate floor on climate change, and it's kind of neat for me to see it looking this crisp and fresh, because after 148 speeches, it's pretty dog-eared and corner-beaten and marked up. But one of the things that happens when you give 148 speeches is that you learn a little bit about your material. And since I'm from the ocean state, and since I'm a politician, I'm going to talk today about two of the things that I've learned a good deal about related to climate change. One is the oceans aspects of climate change, and the other is the political aspects of climate change. So we are terrestrial beings, and the immediate hit from carbon pollution is to the atmosphere. And I think everybody knows that for as long as Homo sapiens has been on the planet, we've been living happily in a 150 to 300 parts per million carbon dioxide range. It's gone up and down within that range, but for as long as our species has been on the planet, that's been the comfortable window in which we've had all of our evolutionary success. Now we've blown through that to 400 and climbing. And as terrestrial beings and as people who breathe this atmosphere, we obviously focus a lot on it, but we overlook at our peril, I think, what's happening in the oceans. Because more than 90% of the excess heat that has been trapped by greenhouse gases has been taken up by the oceans. And there have been people who've said that if it weren't for the heat taken up by the oceans, if all of that excess heat had been trapped instead in the lower atmosphere, we would already be seeing not 2 degrees of temperature increase, but closer to 30 degrees of temperature increase. Not very habitable. So thank God for the oceans. We owe them an immense amount of gratitude for their service to us. So other than that, what else happens when it warms? Well, one thing that happens when it warms is that fish move around. They tend to actually like being in the temperature that they like. And if that temperature is no longer there, then they move. So here is where American lobster has been moving. You can see it from blue up to red, north to south to north, up the New England coast. Rhode Island is sort of between the big blue blob and the also biggish red blob. There's the Atlantic cod moving away from our shores as well as northward. And here's some better news for Rhode Island. The black sea bass is moving up more towards us. But these moves, when they happen, the fish don't mind. They're going with the new water and they can usually cope all right. But for our fishing communities, it's a very big deal when you go looking for lobster where it used to be and it's not there any longer. Or when you go looking for cod where it used to be and it's not there any longer. One of the leaders of Rhode Island's fishing community, a guy named Chris Brown, went out first with his grandfather as an 8-year-old. And then he got his own boat, and he's been fishing all his life. And he remembers what it was like fishing with his grandfather, was what they did. And he says to me, Sheldon, this is not my grandfather's ocean any longer. People are catching grouper and tarpon in Rhode Island waters. It is very peculiar shift. What else happens when it warms? Well, this is the tide gauge at Naval Station Newport in Rhode Island. And one of the things that happens when the ocean warms is that things heat, and when they heat, they tend to get bigger. It's a law of physics, the law of thermal expansion. So all of this heat, that 90+% of the excess heat going into the oceans, grows them. And they can't go down through the bottom, so they grow up along the shores. And this tide gauge measures 10 inches of sea level rise since 1938. In Austin, Texas, 1938 might not mean much, but to New Englanders, 1938 means a lot. There was a hurricane that blew through in 1938 that was a monster. And if you go to Google and read Hurricane of 1938 and click images, you will see massive destruction along the New England coast. Well, 10 inches more sea level out there to throw against our coast in a similar storm, plus whatever the factor is for storm surge. It's not just bathtub 10 inches once the hurricane comes. What does that mean? It means a real risk for all of us. Here's the trend at that same tide gauge, and you can see the blue lines start back at 1930, and they run up to about 2016, the current numbers. And if you plot the trend line through all of that, you see that clearly, it measures an increase in sea level. And our Coastal Resources Management Council is planning on a 6-foot sea level rise for Rhode Island by the end of the century, which is not something that Rhode Islanders are at all happy about. We are already the smallest state. We have very little to give back to the ocean, and 6 feet of sea level rise, even bathtub sea level rise, will make a very big imprint. And when you have to yield even more for what that means in storms and high tides and so forth, it's significant for us. This is downtown Newport, Rhode Island, in the Sandy surge. The weather's not terrible. The guy's out in his kayak. This is storm surge. This is the sea just coming in. And if you'll notice, you can see the shop here where the doors are. So it comes up to the door sill just a few inches. Go back to that, which told you about the 10 inches of sea level rise, and take away the 10 inches. Those doors are dry without that 10 inches. So this has real consequences for real people. What else does it do? Well, not only does the ocean absorb 90% plus of the excess heat, it absorbs 30% of the actual carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide reacts with the surface of the ocean. There is a chemical change. It gets taken up by the ocean, and it becomes a part of the ocean. But when it does that, the chemistry changes the pH, the acidity of the oceans. So the oceans acidify. This is a measure of that acidification in 2000, 2015, what's expected in 2099. Notice first on the far side where it goes from 0 to 1 in the sort of red and orange phases, that it says exposed shells and skeletons likely to dissolve. Creatures do not thrive in environments in which they are soluble. And that is what is beginning to happen. Let me ask you to also look particularly at the west coast of the United States on this map. You can see that along Northern California, Oregon, and up into Canada, it's sort of faintly yellowish in the first graph. When you look over at the second graph, it's now gone much more reddish, and over here, it's full-on red. And what happens is that creatures start to fail when that happens. So this is the humble pteropod, also known as the sea butterfly, because over many years of evolution, its snail foot turned into little wings that fly it through the ocean. It doesn't matter much to human beings, except that in a lot of places it's really the base or a base element of the food chain. That's what it looks like when it's swimming about with its little oceanic wing. That's in the center what a fresh shell looks like that has not been damaged. The dissolving shell is treated with acidified water, and that's what becomes of it. Now, what has happened is that this is now happening along that west coast line because of deep water upwelling that for hydraulic reasons brings a lot more acidified water near the coast than happens on our east coast yet. Preview of coming attractions for us on the east coast. A study was just done a few years ago where scientists from all over the world went out and they caught pteropods all up and down that northwest breadbasket for our fisheries, for the ocean there. And they found that more than 50% of the pteropods that they caught were experiencing severe shell damage. If you kick the bottom out from the food chain, you don't do well. And bringing it back to Rhode Island, this is a quahogger. That's a Rhode Island term for the hard shell clam, the quahog. He's got a bull rake, and down at the end, he's collecting clams in the rake that he brings up. You can see there are lots of boats out. It's a thing that a lot of people do. If you heard Bobby Kennedy talking this morning about having a go out and get it social safety net of support from the environment, this is what people do to supplement their income and to provide nourishment to their families. And if you look at the bottom, you can see those quahogs look pretty sturdy, but they don't always look that way. They start very small. And when they're very small, if their shells dissolve, they never get to be that way. So it's a concern for us in Rhode Island as well. So here you have ocean acidification happening. It's happening at the fastest rate that's been measured, that geologists go back and measure, in 50 million years. And you consider that Homo sapiens has been on the planet about 200,000 years. So 50 million goes back a way, way back. And we started farming and raising animals maybe 20,000 years ago. So the time scale of the last time this happened is astounding. We have the ocean warming in ways that are unprecedented, and we have sea level rise that is presenting new risks for masses of our coastal infrastructure and for our lives. So why don't we do anything about it? Because the denial apparatus that has been set up is really focused on the uncertainties of climate atmospheric modeling. You go to Naval Station Newport, it's basically a glorified yardstick. It is not complicated. You measure the pH with similar equipment to what a middle school class measures its aquarium acid with. And you measure temperature with thermometers. This is not complicated. There's not a whole lot of room for denial. And yet, we don't manage to get anything done about it. So this is where I switch from my oceans persona to my political persona. As a senator, I can tell you exactly what Bobby said this morning is true. Citizens United is the climate change problem in Congress, period, end of story. The power that was given to the fossil fuel industry by this decision is unprecedented in at least 100 years of American history. And they went right to work. The Koch brothers pledged to spend $890 million in this election. Then they dialed it back to only $750. They actually spent $400 million last year, and they're on track to spend the remainder of it this year. $750 million spent in political races makes a big difference. And the intellectual failure, the logical failure of Citizens United was that it overlooked a very simple proposition. And that is, if you're allowed to spend $750 million or $5 million, pick your number, you are able to threaten to spend $750 million. Or you are able to threaten to spend $5 million. You don't actually have to spend it. You can just go into somebody and say, cross us on climate change, and it's your ass. And they're saying that not only privately, I wouldn't be in the rooms when they're saying that, but they're saying it publicly. Americans for Prosperity, the big Koch group, has said, cross us on climate change and you will be, quote, severely disadvantaged. They've talked about the political peril that they have created around this issue. Severely disadvantaged and political peril are their words, not mine. So yes, we do need to overturn Citizens United, And the phenomenon is actually observable by people who are around the Senate. The star is 2010. Before 2010, we had regular activity in the Senate on climate change. Senator Collins, Republican, had a bill. Senator John Warner of Virginia, Republican, had a bill. Senator John McCain, Republican of Arizona, had a bill, and indeed ran for president on a good climate platform, a very strong one. And you can actually Google his speech. It's a hell of a good speech. I wish he still gave it. Lamar Alexander of Tennessee, Republican, had a bill. Over and over and over again, there was constant Republican activity on climate change until 2010, and since then it has been a dead flat line because of the threat of that spending. And the Koch brothers and their folks have been clever. They haven't gone after everybody, they've gone after the Republicans. Because if they can beat the Republican Party into submission and capture it on climate change, they can mask what is basically old-fashioned, more or less corrupt, special interest, special pleading as some feature of the culture wars. That this isn't about the fossil fuel industry, this is Republicans versus Democrats. Well, that's an artificial creation by the fossil fuel industry thanks to Citizens United. That flat line was created by the fossil fuel industry. And here's part of how it works. Interestingly, scientists are starting to look at the phony science enterprise of climate denial. They're starting to use the tools of legitimate science to look into the paid-for science of climate denial. One of them is Dr. Robert Bruhl of Drexel University. There are others, Riley Dunlap in Oklahoma, Justin Farrell at Yale, Naomi Oreskes at Harvard, who did Merchants of Doubt. There are a whole array of scientists looking at this, and this is a graph Dr. Bruhl plotted of how the money and information flows through the climate denial network. They're not just beating up on Republicans in elections and crushing the party into a state of compliance with fossil fuel orthodoxy. They are also marketing the climate denial message. And they market it through this whole vast array of organizations. Each one of those dots is a separate organization. The big one, the blue diamond at the center of the web, is something called Donors Trust, Donors Capital, which is a laundry machine for money so that it can go to these organizations, which have phony baloney names, so you don't necessarily know that they're fossil fuel front groups, but if you follow the money, then you'd know. So Donors Trust, Donors Capital is the laundry machine where the money can go in from the special interest donors and come out clean of any reference to the fossil fuel donor. And then it goes where directed, and it's identity laundering on a massive, massive scale. So I took 18 senators to the Senate floor to raise hell about probably 20 of those organizations. Our pitch was that this is a coordinated enterprise. These are not individual entities just doing their thing. It's like Hydra. You know, same beast, many tentacles, same beast. So what they did was they wrote us a letter accusing us of tyranny and all sorts of horrors, but they put all of their logos on the letter together. So I'm keeping that letter as Exhibit A in how this is like one beast. And you'll notice, what could be sweeter than the Heartland Institute? I mean, really, who could disagree with the Heartland Institute? The Heartland Institute put up the billboards comparing climate scientists to the Unabomber. That's the contribution of Heartland to the debate. Then you've got groups like the James Madison Institute. As a lawyer and a somewhat constitutional amateur studier, the idea that you steal James Madison's name and put it on top of a climate denial front, or John Locke. My God, Locke and Montesquieu were the two guys who were the architects of the American system of government. They were the intellectual underpinnings for the founding fathers. Stole their name. There's a George C. Marshall Institute, the guy who rebuilt Europe after World War II and was the, Winston Churchill, I think, called him the architect of victory. Steal his name, put it up there. And if you hide where the money comes from, the average newspaper editor sees George C. Marshall Institute. Well, it looks pretty legit. So they are using this immense array, and this is just a few of them. But people are starting to get onto it. So thank you to Naomi Oreskes. Thank you to Neela Banerjee and the team at Inside Climate News. We need to support the people who are putting the spotlight on the climate denial apparatus. Because if all people see in America is their product, then the narrative is lost. We have to make sure they're looking at the machinery that puts out the phony baloney science, and those connections that Dr. Brule has drawn, that will help us change the narrative. So let me go to the good guys first. These are all companies that have really excellent climate policies internally. Really excellent ones, some of the best. Every single one of them signed the Paris Pledge calling for a strong agreement in Paris. It made a difference because it quieted down Republican opposition when they saw the entire, basically the entire legitimate corporate hierarchy of the United States of America lined up for that. Here's the thing that you need to know. For all the good that they do inside their fence lines, and for all the good that many of them do pushing sustainability out their supply chains, nobody comes to Washington to lobby on climate. The corporate presence on climate change in Washington, setting aside the fossil fuel guys, we know where they are. Get them all out. Just the good guys. Their lobbying presence in Washington is net negative. In a week, I had 3 lobbying groups come in. TechNet, which represents Apple, Google, Microsoft, and believe it or not, a bunch of green energy companies. I had the lumber and timber industry come in. You know the pine beetles doing to the forests out west? You know what warming climates are doing to the hardwoods in New England? And we had the property casualty insurance industry visit for their lobbying, who write the checks when things go wrong. If you put all of them together, TechNet, the lumber, timber industry, and the property casualty insurance industry, and you took their whole array of lobbying topics and added them all up, guess how many times climate change was mentioned? 0. 0. Let me give you another example. CocaCola and Pepsi. Coke and Pepsi have really good climate policies. You go to the Pepsi site and you see that their CEO is saying brilliant things about climate change. But they don't lobby hardly at all. Pepsi participates in series a little bit. But their big lobbying organization is called the American Beverage Association. If you look at the spending of the American Beverage Association, it spiked several years ago, about the time Obamacare was being discussed, because there was conversation about a soda tax to help pay for it. So they came to town, and they did their thing, and the soda tax idea crashed, and then the spending went back down to almost nothing. So Coke and Pepsi say good things. Pepsi helps a little bit with series, but the people they lobby through at the American Beverage Association do nothing on climate. And then they take money that is run from Coke and Pepsi through the American Beverage Association, and they give it to the US Chamber of Commerce. The US Chamber of Commerce is an implacable enemy of ours on doing anything about climate change. Non-stop. National Association of Manufacturers, the same. American Petroleum Institute, the same. There's a whole array of them. But the US Chamber of Commerce is the big kahuna of corporate lobbying in Washington. So if you look at what Coke and Pepsi are doing in Washington, they get basically 1 point between the two of them for Pepsi participating in series. They get 0 points for what their lobbying group, the American Beverage Association, does, because it does nothing. And they get about 90 points against them because they're funding and not separating themselves from the most politically powerful lobby shop that is leading climate denial in Washington. So we have to get after the good guys, because it will make a difference if senators from Georgia hear from Coca-Cola that this matters. It will make a difference if senators from Arkansas hear from Walmart that this matters. It will make a difference if people who would like to be with us And I would count a dozen Republican senators who would like to be with us on climate change, but don't see a safe path. They think they'll get slaughtered. They don't think they have a single friend. If they'd get together and say, we understand they're going to come after you. We understand the bully tactics of the fossil fuel industry. We, as a group of 40 or 50, will have your back. If they would organize and do that, Washington opens up with possibilities. And I'll close with wonderful Pope Francis and his great words. He has pointed out, and I guess he's somewhat expert in this area, that God always forgives. And then he went on to say, mankind, we sometimes forgive. And then he delivered the punchline. Nature, he said, she never forgives. You slap her, and she will slap you back. So before we get slapped back, we need to take action. And thank you to Pope Francis, and thank you to you all for being here. Catherine, are you going to come up and
I am.
Coordinate questions?
Yes, have a seat.
Catherine Hayhoe is one of my heroes. She is in the awkward space of being an evangelical climate scientist. But it turns out that there's actually not much conflict there once you take away the special interest interference.
Mm-hmm. You know you're in the right place when you get it from both sides. Thank you for coming to this. Wasn't this an amazing speech? This man has given so many speeches, more than any other legislator in this country, and so it's amazing to actually hear him in person. So my first question actually comes from me. If you have a question, the app, what's it called again, Slido? The Slido app is the way to get your questions up there or to vote questions up to the top. We have about 10 minutes to take questions here. There it is. And I'm going to ask the first question here. It's okay, I can read them to you too.
Great.
My question is, just before you came, we were talking about how important it is to connect our values to the issue of climate change. Because one of the biggest myths people believe is that you can only care about it if you're this type of person.
Yep.
And if I'm not that person, then I don't care.
Yep.
So I can tell that you're very passionate about this. What is the real connection to your heart on this issue?
Probably what's happening in our oceans.
Mm-hmm.
I've been scuba diving since I was a young teenager. I sail as much as I can in the summertime. The ocean provides moments of real magic. Mm-hmm. The week that Pope Francis spoke to us, I came home, went out late on the boat, the sun was setting, it was absolutely beautiful. You still had the afterglow of the sun having set. It was September in New England. I mean, it doesn't get more pretty than that. And suddenly my little sailboat is surrounded by porpoises. Ugh. That doesn't happen, as you know. That doesn't happen in Rhode Island. They're very, very, very intermittent visitors. So suddenly I'm out alone in the sunset, surrounded by these creatures, and you just think, I assumed it was Francis sending angels, but I don't know. You just get these moments, and they happen. And the idea that we in our stupidity and our greed are ruining those resources for the people who would like to enjoy them in the future, generations to come, just makes me ill. Yeah. I'll also add, I'm a son of a Foreign Service officer. I grew up with a very strong sense of America's presence overseas. The idea that we who profit so much from example, Bill Clinton has said that the power of our example has always mattered more in the world than any example of our power. What example are we showing the world right now about American democracy when we let one greedy special interest so control our politics that we're willing to overlook these conditions? I mean, it is truly disgraceful. And the idea that you can behave disgracefully and get away with it is not a mature point of view. Mm-hmm. And it's a dangerous world out there, and if we're not going to show leadership, I mean, you go back to what Daniel Webster said at the Bunker Hill Memorial. If America fails at leadership, at example, then it's the death knell of liberty throughout the world.
Yeah.
So we're playing for high stakes when we're letting this foolishness happen.
Mm-hmm. I think you can see there's that love and passion and care in the heart, but there's also that sense of outrage. And I mean, I've definitely resonated with that myself. I am outraged when I see people using, for example, when I see them using the Bible or God as an excuse for completely anti-biblical and unloving behavior. And that is similar to what we're seeing here.
Yep.
So, number one question everybody wants to know, raised by your presentation, is what's going to happen with the House, quote, Science Committee, and I agree with those quotes.
Yep.
What's going to happen with the House Science Committee taking action against state attorneys for Exxon New?
The procedural status is that the House has issued subpoenas to the attorneys general and a demand letter to the Securities and Exchange Commission and subpoenas to a variety of NGOs. You don't move to quash, I'm being a lawyer now, a congressional subpoena the way you do a regular litigation subpoena. Mm-hmm. You say no. And then the committee has to move to enforce its subpoena. And that would be the next step. Does Chairman Smith move in court to enforce his subpoena, or does he just drop it? Mm-hmm. I think that he is walking down a very treacherous path if he moves to enforce it, because he then gets in front of a judge against a whole bunch of attorneys general who will be able to say three very convincing things. One, this is unprecedented. We've had the Congressional Research Service look at previous congressional subpoenas to state agencies. The only one they were able to find was to a port administrator about 80 years ago, and he told them to pound sand. Mm-hmm. And there was a fuss over it, and I think it just got dropped at that point. So the idea that you get to go after attorneys general with the subpoena authority is unprecedented. Mm-hmm. The second thing is that it reeks of conflict of interest, because he's only taken an interest when Exxon is the target. Mm-hmm. And he's very connected politically to Exxon. Mm-hmm. So it's not just that you're taking an unprecedented effort into obstructing the course of an attorney general investigation, it's that you're doing it on behalf of the subject of the investigation. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that's a road they want to go too far down. And finally, the argument that they make is that there's a First Amendment protection here for ExxonMobil that is being violated. That is wrong as a matter of law. You don't have to guess about that. This is not a gray area for lawyers. First Amendment protection, First Amendment protection, First Amendment protection, fraud, no First Amendment protection. So the question is it fraud or is it First Amendment protected? You can't answer that question by saying you can't ask it because of the First Amendment. That is a logical fallacy, and judges don't tolerate logical fallacies very well. Right. So where it gets really interesting is once you get in front of that judge, what if the attorneys general say, you know what? Not only are we not complying, but in order for the court to understand what's going on here, the court actually needs to look at the files of the committee. Because if this is in fact the hand of ExxonMobil inside the glove of the committee, seeking to obstruct an ongoing law enforcement investigation, that raises different constitutional questions about the subpoena power. Exactly. And we need to know that. And the only way we're going to know that is if they have to cough up their files, and now you've got a real standoff. Because I very much doubt that that committee wants to have its conversations with the fossil fuel industry on this subject become public. So they've got some high-risk problems both in winning the case and in what happens if they get their own files opened up. Watch with interest.
Yes. This is very personally fascinating because as a graduate student, I actually worked with Exxon colleagues and published several of the papers with them, specifically talking about the role of non-CO2 greenhouse gases in meeting the Kyoto target. So yes, did they know? Absolutely.
Absolutely.
We were publishing papers in the 1990s about that. All right, so here's the burning question also. What is it going to take to overturn Citizens United?
A big chunk of it can be overturned by law. Mm-hmm. The part that allows dark money can be overturned by law because the decision itself didn't approve dark money. It just approved unlimited money. The dark money has been a failure of enforcement by the Internal Revenue Service, the Federal Election Commission, and the Department of Justice. With a law that makes the situation clearer, and I am the author of the Disclose 2.0 Act that does this, we could clear up that part of the mess. Then at least you know what's going on. Donors Trust no longer works because they've got to report every $10,000 plus laundering transit through their laundry machine. So that's one thing that we can do. The second thing is that we can appoint judges who will overturn it. And interestingly, Chief Justice Roberts sowed the seeds of its destruction some years ago with the doctrine that a decision that continues to be hotly contested doesn't have as much precedential effect as one that isn't. Now, I think he was doing that in order to tee up his own Gang of Five to hotly contest things that they didn't like, so that they could then say, aha, you see, we hotly contested it, so now it's not real precedent, so we can take it down. But no decision is more hotly contested than Citizens United. So, you know, if you're going to live by the sword, you could die by the sword. Last thing, I would bet that if they had to do it over, you would lose Justice Kennedy and Justice Roberts on Citizens United. They made such a hash of that decision, and it blew up in their faces so badly, and it was such a different world than they imagined. They imagined a world in which ExxonMobil would get on the television and say, vote against Senator Whitehouse because he's a real thorn in our side. This is ExxonMobil. We approve this message. And they do it on their own. Instead, you have Americans for Puppies and Prosperity out there, which nobody's ever heard of, which can say incredible slime because there's no accountability for the slime. They can lie because there's no accountability for the lie, and they can spend unlimited money sliming and lying. And that's the world that we live in right now. And that's not, given the best foot forward for them, that's not what they intended or expected. They were just so, it's the first Supreme Court in American history to have nobody who's ever served in office or run for office on it. So it's the most ignorant Supreme Court in history about politics. So when you make grandiose decisions about something where you know nothing, you make grandiose errors. And I think they're realizing this was a grandiose error, and facts are just completely undermining that decision.
That's incredible.
And it's taking the credibility of the court down with it. Now most Americans don't believe that they can get a fair shot against a corporation in the United States Supreme Court.
Right.
That's not a situation that court wants to maintain.
Exactly. All right. So a question here is, are there Republicans leading on climate change now? And the quick answer to that is Citizens Climate Lobby has this amazing bipartisan climate solutions caucus, where they're very carefully balancing Democrats and Republicans to try to propose solutions. So this is our final question to you.
Yep.
If you can get one bill through, what would it be and what would it do?
Would be my bill.
Exactly, yes. But tell us what your bill is, yes. Of course that's the best one, but explain.
It would take the social cost of carbon that has been developed by the Office of Management and Budget in the federal government, and that has twice been upheld by federal courts, and it would apply it as a carbon fee to the importation or extraction of fossil fuels. So you pay at the border or at the mine mouth or at the wellhead. And with the revenues that you then get, first of all, that changes the market signal so that every choice that's made by people who aren't even thinking about climate change starts to be in the direction of the right and not the direction of the wrong. And then you lower corporate income taxes and you give $500 per person stipends to anybody who pays payroll taxes, gets Social Security, or gets a veteran's benefit. And it's an offset to what is probably the biggest subsidy in the history of the world. If you do the math right now on what $45 per ton, which is what it would be, times the actual measured carbon emissions in the United States of America is, you get north of $200 billion per year. So that's an effective subsidy to this industry of $200 billion per year. No wonder they'll spend $750 million. That's chump change. This is 1,000 to 1 ROI. And if you look at the International Monetary Fund, which is not idiots, they have done a more elaborate calculation of what they call the effective subsidy of carbon pollution in the United States, and they came out at $700 billion a year. So there's a big adjustment that you can make, and if you give all the money back through other lower tax rates and through distribution, then it ought to meet traditional Republican orthodoxy.
Yeah.
And that is why every single Republican that I am aware of who has thought climate change through to a solution has come to that place. Whether it's former EPA administrators, former Treasury secretaries, former members of Congress, conservative economists like Arthur Laffer, they all come to the same place. A border adjustable, revenue neutral price on carbon. Boom. My answer to them is, sure, we'll do it your way.
Yeah.
If that's the way you insist on doing it, we'll do it your way. If not, we'll keep regulating.
Exactly. And to skeptics who may say that sounds like a fairy story, could it ever happen? The news is it has already been happening, correct?
Yeah.
It's been happening in British Columbia since 2008.
Canada just demanded that every province comply.
Yep.
And you're seeing it begin to emerge also in individual states and groups of states that have gathered together to do carbon trading.
Exactly.
So it's emerging.
It is real and it is happening. So this is the end of our conversation for now, but please continue it on Twitter at Sen Whitehouse. Is that right? I'm Kay Hayhoe. We're also on Facebook, and we'd love to keep talking about this. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming out and joining us.